Good morning, Professor Acemoglu.
Good morning, Danilo. How are you doing?
I'm very well. What about you?
I'm wonderful, and I'm delighted to share
Great.
the Zoom stage or the virtual stage with you,
Right,
Danilo. I'm
right,
sorry I can't be there in person, but
right. But welcome to Milan in any case. Thank you for
it's
being
one of my
with
favorite cities, so it's my
us.
loss. But
That's
after
very good.
coronavirus, we'll do it again.
We will wait for your visit. Thank you for being here today. And good afternoon to everybody on this side of the Atlantic. We are here today to discuss the new book that Professor Acemoglu wrote with James Robinson. The original title of the book is The Narrow Corridor, and it is being published in Italy by Il Saggiatore with the title La Strettoia. That is the same title than in the American edition. And the title of this discussion today, this evening, is Safeguarding Liberty. And we will try to understand what means safeguarding liberty today in this political, geopolitical, and pandemic situation that is not easy to understand. Professor Acemoglu teaches economics at MIT in Boston, and as you probably know, or the public here, he is one of the most quoted economists in the world, one of the most important economists in the world. Let me say that this is an extraordinary book, in my opinion. It is extraordinary for the volume of work that it contains. It is extraordinary for the knowledge that the authors have put into it. It is extraordinary for intellectual elaboration and for the thought that there is in the book and for the brilliance of the writing. Almost every page is fascinating and every page is thought-provoking. I liked it very much.
Thank you, Danilo.
It's not a book. It's not a book in about economics in strict terms. It is about history. It is about politics, about institutions, about culture, and it is a theoretical and empirical and an historical analysis, populated by events. So it's very interesting and fascinating to read. The book is in many ways the continuation of a previous one, Why Nations Fail, very famous one, published a few years ago, and in my opinion is even more well-timed than Why Nations Fail. It is perfect for understanding or try to understand and discuss the big failure of major institutions during the pandemic. I think this one can be one point of our conversation today. Why Nations Fail was an analysis of different kinds of institutions and about their importance for development, particularly for the extractive institutions that are substantially the ones based on exploitation, and on one side, on the other side, the inclusive institutions. And it was about the impossibility for divorcing the economic trajectory of a country from its political institutional trajectory. And the analysis was about the critical juncture, the moment when countries take a path towards failure or towards prosperity. La Strettoia, the narrow path, is about the relationship between the state and the society, in the sense that the two authors say that in order to have a free, democratic, and prosperous country, you need a strong and efficient state and also a strong society, capable to keep the state in check in some way, changed or shackled, as the authors write in the book. Acemoglu and Robinson define three different leviathans, the marine beasts that regulate life in society following the Obesian definition. The despotic leviathan, that is terror, dictatorship. The absent leviathan, that is violent, that is anarchic, or can be a cage of rules, archaic rules or religious rules. And the third one, that is a narrow path between the two, is the shackled leviathan, a leviathan in chains in some way. We don't like the despotic leviathan, being it the Nazi regime or the Chinese regime. We don't like the absent leviathan in the form of the power of the outlaws in Somalia or the Islamic State in Syria. And we know that the shackled leviathan, the shackled state is better, but we need the society to keep it chained enough in order to give us a good chunk of liberty. In the book, Acemoglu and Robinson say that the shackled state can fail. Chile during the 70s, the Republic of Weimar, the Italian Comuni, and so on. But maybe now we notice that there are other ways of failing, probably, and this way is failing for incompetence, as during the pandemic in many Western countries right now. Here is my first question for Professor Acemoglu. Are we now at the critical juncture in which countries risk to fail because of the pandemic, particularly Western countries? And do we need to add the role of competence in what we need from the shackled state?
Thank you, Danilo. Thanks for that introduction and thanks for that wonderful question. And the answer in my mind is undoubtedly yes. We are at a critical juncture. In Why Nations Fail, where we first define critical juncture, we define it as a state of affairs where current institutions are incapable of dealing with the challenges, stresses, and difficulties that have always been with us. And as a result, we are in a situation where major institutional change can happen, but does not always happen. And when it does happen, we don't know in what direction it's going to go. So I think we are definitely in such a situation. However, perhaps a little differently than many people who are emphasizing the importance of COVID-19, which of course has been an amazing shock and has been, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, 1919, together with the Great Depression rolled into one. But I think all of these problems were present before COVID-19. They were not caused by COVID-19. COVID-19 created loss of life and has led to a major recession. But for the bigger structural problems that you are talking about, Danilo, it has just been an accelerator and a clarifier. It's put a spotlight on those issues. Take the US, the huge increase in inequality, the erosion of public trust in institutions, the erosion of competence in bureaucracy, polarization. All of these were there in huge measure before the pandemic. Italy, another country that's been really badly affected. Italy hasn't had productivity growth for over 3 decades. It has had political gridlock, failing political institutions for at least 2 decades and longer. So, I think these are problems for which we were going to pay anyway. And the COVID-19 pandemic has ensured that we pay sooner and a more coordinated way around the world. Otherwise it could have been that Italy goes into a crisis before the US and the UK goes before Italy, but now we're all in crisis. So it's a good wake-up call for us. So that's the situation as I see it, and unfortunately, many of our leaders are trying not to wake up.
Right. The Chinese state seems to be more competent sometimes, sometimes very competent. Do we need to become more Chinese in order to answer all of these sort of questions?
I hope not, because the Chinese state indeed has always had a tradition of bureaucratic efficiency going back to 2,500 years, to the Qin dynasty. But that has always been embedded in a despotic system. And by despotic, thank you for that wonderful introduction, by despotic system or despotic leviathan, we mean not necessarily a state that will always kill its citizens in large numbers like the Nazi state, but a state that is one that imposes rules and choices on its people and does not take any input from its people. So all of the wonderful things that we have come to expect from our governments, the services that we want, the flexibility because we demand it, those things are not going to happen under a despotic leviathan. On the other hand, the things that it does, it may do them quite well. There are very efficient despotic leviathans, and again, China is one of them. And during certain times when it's very clear what needs to be done, there is very little conflict between what different people want during a kind of pandemic. Everybody wants to control the pandemic. Those are particularly good times for a despotic leviathan. But on the other hand, we also know that several non-despotic leviathans have done extremely well during this pandemic. The country that really stands out in its amazing response is Taiwan, not China. Hong Kong was doing very well until Chinese, dismantling of its democratic institutions has taken a new high level. South Korea and Germany have done very well as well. So, what's common among these countries? Well, the way that they've dealt with the problem is very different. Taiwan has done it with a civil society movements, very technology savvy, but very effective at track and tracing, and very little heavy hand of the government from the top. The government has worked with civil society. China has done it more with the heavy hand. What's common among these countries is not the way that they have done it, but they have also followed certain scientific principles, and they have used high levels of state capacity. So what really distinguishes these countries is the high level of state capacity. And it's no surprise, in my opinion, that the countries that have really failed during this crisis, US, Brazil, India, Italy, Spain, those are countries which have very bad track record recently of state capacity, state's ability to deal with challenges. So that's where we're seeing the big divide.
Right. There is a problem of trust between people and governments in those countries.
But it is a problem for good reason. People don't trust the state because the state has proven that
Absolutely.
for a variety of reasons it cannot act. It is not doing. And again, this goes way beyond, way before the pandemic. In Italy, you wouldn't say that the state had shown itself to be gloriously competent before the pandemic. Same thing in Brazil, same thing in India, same thing definitely in the US. And the US is the real turnaround here, because if you looked at the US 40 years ago, US was a leader in state capacity, competence, bureaucratic organizations such as Forestry Service, environmental agencies, Department of Energy, NASA, internal bureaucracies. Those were all at the forefront of what the world was doing in terms of, the good side of bureaucracy, bringing services, using consistent rules and scientific methods. And now it's been a complete turnaround.
Right. It was an international leadership now disappeared. Yes, that's very important, I think. Do you see any danger in the growing role of the state during the pandemic? I mean, do you see the risk of a sort of sanitary leviathan or a digital leviathan?
Of course, I do absolutely. And but let me put the conclusion first, and then I'll explain it. I think that is a real risk, but it is a smaller risk relative to not doing anything. So I think it is a risk we have to take, but we have to manage it. We have to understand what we are doing. I think the truth of the matter is that we are at a point when the state needs to shoulder more responsibilities. Once again, this was the case before the pandemic, and the pandemic has just exacerbated it. Before the pandemic, the state needed to play more of a role, especially in the US and the UK and much of the developing world, for bringing better social safety net and social insurance programs, for limiting inequality, for playing more of a defining role in redirecting technological change so that technological change benefits more people and deals with issues such as climate change. So we had a lot of challenges on our plate before the pandemic. And those were challenges that, contrary to what some on the right claimed, it would not have been for the market to deal by itself. There were also challenges, contrary to what some on the left claimed, that we had to deal with completely via state fiat. So we had to already develop new ways for the state to play a major role as a leader, as a coordinator, but then work with the market. So that was already something. We have experience of it in the past, but new challenges, new ways of dealing with it, new types of technology. So we had to remake many of those compacts. And the pandemic has, of course, added to that, because now the global health challenges, which were present before, but we have now become aware, we have to deal with them. We have to deal with track and tracing. We have to increase government indebtedness. Government fiscal policy has to become more aggressive. All of those are true. So, but how do you do that? That's both a scientific question and a political question. Let me leave the scientific one aside for a second and we can come back to it. But the political one is exactly what Hayek worried about. When the original welfare state was in the making, had already emerged in Scandinavia, and the Beveridge Report in 1942 had been published in the UK in the darkest hour of the war, but already being implemented in the middle of the war to bring national health insurance, minimum wages, social security, redistributive policies. And Hayek thought this was very dangerous precisely because of the reason you've articulated, Danilo, that the state was becoming more important, more powerful. Administrative controls by the state were going to be more widespread. And he thought this is a new path to serfdom, or a new path to totalitarianism, just like the one that he knew well in Nazi Europe, in Nazi Germany, and in Russia.
Right.
But in the event, Hayek turned out to be wrong. And that's actually very important for our book, because it actually captures the essence of the narrow corridor. The reason why Hayek turned out to be wrong wasn't because his concerns were unfounded. No, his concerns were founded, but he turned out to be wrong because he underestimated society. He underestimated the fact that in the narrow corridor, if you can stay in the narrow corridor, democracy would be deepened. So society, civil society, media would develop new ways of monitoring, keeping in check the state that is becoming more powerful. Society would run together with the state. It would become deeper, more powerful, higher capacity itself. And that's exactly what happened. So that's what we have to aspire for, using scientific methods for working out what's the best path, putting the right responsibilities on the shoulders of the state. But then we have to be much more active, much more democratic, much more vigilant as civil society, in order to make sure that the state or its corrupt politicians or its indifferent bureaucrats don't act in bad ways. That requires a lot from us. And you know who has been failing more than the state? We as a society. We haven't been carrying out our democratic duties. We haven't been carrying out our duties as participants in civil society, in organizations, in civic engagement. I think those are the things that have to be remade as well.
So if I understand correctly, it is the civil society that creates the brakes to slow down the powers of
absolutely. And I think there's no place better to understand to understand that fully than in Italy, because Italy Italy's glorious past is one of that civil society, the communes,
Right.
in places like
Right.
Milan, Torino, Florence. You see this amazing flourishing that comes not because somebody wrote a beautiful constitution, not because some leader said, I'm going to be a virtuous leader. No, because the civil society itself was the one that worked hard and really made sure that the rulers act in the proper way, and they act in order to serve society.
But why this happened in some countries and not in other countries? I mean, in your book, you say that Europe was the center of, was the birth of the shackled Leviathan was Europe.
Well,
Why
that's a
Europe
wonderful question.
and not China and not Africa, not India?
That's a wonderful question, Danilo. And I think it's a central question. We try to tackle it in the narrow corridor, but I think, it's very difficult to explain these things. But let me I'll mention our explanation, but I want to make a general point first, which is that I think both social scientists and interested readers and lay people, they have a tendency to think, well, if something has happened in history, it must have a definite explanation. And it must have some sort of geographic or cultural, something, tangible that we can get our hands on. Actually, reality is often much more contingent. Lots of accident, lots of small things coming together, lots of little institutional innovations that some people are able to do, the right coalitions they are able to form. So that's why you see, actually, when you look at the data, and people who want to explain things with geography or culture often ignore these things. But when you look at the data, you see a huge amount of variation. In Italy, wonderful things were happening, as far back as 1100 years ago. But go a little bit further north from the northern Italian cities, and you go into the Balkans, and the opposite was happening there.
Right.
So it's not like a very simple explanation. But, Europe, I don't think it was the European culture or European geography. In the book, we point out that really what made Europe embark on a very different path is that it came close to the corridor, or it entered the corridor early on because of a number of accidental events. The Western Roman Empire collapsed spectacularly, while the Eastern one didn't, for example. In that collapse, authority completely disappeared, but the institutions didn't. So the Catholic Church remained, the blueprints of administrative ways of organizing territories, providing services, those remain. And then a new band of Germanic people, the Franks, and who then became the Carolingian and Merovingians, and the Carolingians came, and they brought their own traditions, and these two fused together. The Roman ones pulling in the direction of state strength, the Frankish ones pulling in this direction of what historian Christopher Wiggum calls assembly politics, bottom-up participation. And those two fused to create that early balance, which then was important for Europe to, in a very, very, very jagged, very tortuous way, travel in the Nora corridor for hundreds of years.
Right. Right, very interesting. In the book, you write that the United States are in a disequilibrium in some way. What do you mean with that? And also, do you think that the presidential elections has been? I think it has been a great democratic exercise. Probably we have seen in the last few days. And do you think that the American Leviathan is now more chained than before?
No, unfortunately, it's too soon to celebrate. I think the structural problems that brought us Donald Trump are present. I'm sorry. Look, over the last 6 years, so many books were written about how the Enlightenment project was a complete failure. People wanted dictators in the US or in France or in Brazil. And there is some truth to that, but there's a huge amount of exaggeration. If you look at the American electorate, 3 more million people voted for Hillary Clinton, and none of those, very few of those, would have even imagined to have Donald Trump as their president, let alone wanted. So it was a divided society. And today it is a divided society too. A couple more million have shifted away or turned out to vote than they didn't for Hillary Clinton. They did so for Joe Biden. I think that's great. That's fantastic. Donald Trump has done irreparable damage to American institutions. But the problems haven't gone away. We are a polarized society. We remain a polarized society. And so is Brazil, and so is India, and so is the UK. And that polarization is a problem that is going to cost us. And that polarization itself, I'll come back to that, Danilo, but that polarization itself is also rooted in economic problems. It's rooted in the fact that we've had 30, 40 years of the fastest period of technological progress, if you count it by the number of patents, fastest period of globalization. But millions of people in Italy, millions of people in the UK, tens of millions of people in the US have not benefited from it. And not only that, but have been silenced. And the democratic system hasn't worked. So those are the fundamental problems that are then leading to this polarization. But that polarization is going to make it very difficult to build these high capacity institutions that we talked about, to create some sort of a coalition that's broad enough and has some sort of a broad agreement on common themes. You'd never expect that to be true for 100% of the population. But if you look at the signature achievement of Western civilization over the last hundreds of years, it isn't, the monuments that we built. It isn't the armaments. It's not all of these things. It's really the political system and peace that European countries were able to build after World War II, which brought shared prosperity. It brought 40 years of the fastest growth that the world has ever experienced. It reduced poverty. It elevated people to the middle class, active citizen status. Those are amazing achievements. And how did we do that? We did that because we formed new institutions under a shared understanding that we wanted peace in Europe, we wanted to have prosperity in Europe, and we wanted that prosperity to be broadly shared. But that's going to be very difficult to achieve. That new corridor that I mentioned a moment ago, that's going to be much harder to achieve because of that polarization. So I think we all have, on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as in the emerging world, we have a very challenging future ahead of us. It's not hopeless. I can be cautiously optimistic or I can be pessimistic, but it's not hopeless. And we have to understand those challenges. And I don't think that just the overnight election of Joe Biden removes those challenges. It just gives us a little bit of a more hope that we can do something, but we have to use that.
But what is, in a situation of crisis, what is the difference between political polarization and political conversation? Probably it is inevitable to have polarization when you have big crises, profound crises. What do you think?
Perhaps you may be right, Danilo. I'm not sure. But again, one history that I know a little bit is that of the beginning of the welfare state in Sweden, for example.
Yeah.
That happened 2 years after, or started happening 2 years after Great Depression came to Sweden. Huge dislocation in that country as well as in the rest of Europe. Unemployment shot up. People were losing their livelihoods and jobs. But it was possible that during that time, for political leaders, with the support of their supporters, to form a relatively broad coalition. First, workers and farmers came together, then the business community joined. Of course, there were dissenting voices, but there was a remarkable breadth to the coalition that is so important and that is so central for us to try to emulate. And that's going to be very difficult to do today. And again, also in Europe after World War II, if you look at who built the welfare state, well, the Social Democrats played a leading role, but in many countries it was the center-right. So there was a lot of disagreements between the center-right and the Social Democrats or the socialists, but they came together for the most important decisions. Again, that's going to be very much harder.
Right. Staying for a while on Europe, don't you think that also Europe during the pandemic has been quite a lot problematic, and even the European welfare state has failed in some way? Do you have this impression? And do you think that Europe could play the role of the defender of the values of liberty, open society?
Oh, I don't think it's a question of whether it could or not. It must. I think it must. I think Europe, the responsibilities for Europe are much greater moving forward than in the past. And the reason for that is because, China has become much more assertive, and it has become a true power when we come to the area of AI, for example. AI, big data, monitoring, face recognition, internet control, those are all going to be with us in the next decades. China's push is going to be to use those technologies more and more to extinguish liberty. There's no doubt about that. The US has become more and more unstable, polarized, as we've just talked about. But even if it could shake out that polarization, it will be very, very influenced always by big tech. So that's going to be the Google, Amazon, Facebook agenda.
Right.
And it's going to go in a different direction than China. Those companies are not, going to ever use data for repression, but they are going to use data for control, for a different type of control. And privacy is going to disappear. And they are going to reshape the future of technology much more after their own image. Algorithms replacing humans, giving much less autonomy to humans. So we need a different beacon. And European Union is best placed for that. If it can pool its resources, meaning countries together, it has a presence. It has proven that it is much more forward-looking when it comes to issues of privacy and antitrust in the area of technology. It has not been as beholden to the view of AI is master and humans are its servants. And it's got a good tradition of democratic values being defended in Europe over the last 80 years. So all of those put together makes me think that Europe has a special role to play. Unfortunately, very, very unfortunate from my point of view, the UK has left Europe. And that is a real damaging thing. But, I'm still optimistic. I need to be optimistic that Europe can play this role, but that means that Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, they need to come together with a unique blend of using technology for humanity's benefits, not for companies, not for monitoring. So there is a lot of work to be done in Europe.
I understand that the need of this role of Europe, but do you think that in a world of great powers competition, can Europe be the beacon of the democratic values without United States, without the sustain of the United States?
I don't know. Great question, Danilo. I don't know. But, first of all, it may well be that if Europe leads, US follows. For certain things, there will be an agreement between US and Europe. For certain other things, Europe needs to articulate its own view and hope that it can convince. Look, today in the US, a movement to control the power of big tech is emerging. But I don't think it will ever be powerful enough successful enough to do it by itself. So European Commission will have an important role. But it's not just about bureaucrats controlling, it's about a vision also. I've devoted, much of my time over the last decade, especially after the completion of the narrow corridor like 2 years ago, to trying to articulate a vision where we use technology differently than what we have done before, because exactly of the issues that we have just talked about. So that vision is very important to understand, adopt, explain, and use in policymaking.
Right. Professor, can you tell us something about your opinion on China? Because we lived in the last few decades in the hope that the economic development of the country, the success of the country in the economy could translate on more democracy, a little bit more liberty. Now, with Xi Jinping, with the president, China seems to be much more despotic than before. And how do you see the development of capitalism and the state in China?
Wasn't that naive? That the belief that somehow China was going to transform itself? In fact, you know this, Danilo, but I'll say it for the readers and the listeners. This is how we start the narrow corridor. That I think there is something in James and my opinion fundamentally wrong with the view that somehow all countries are going to emulate each other in terms of their political development. No, I think the historical evidence and history are very clear here that diversity, different paths, is the order of the day. And if you look at China, its institutions, its approach between state and society, the way that bureaucracy functions, its norms have evolved over very, very long time in a very different equilibrium than the one in Italy or the UK or the US. So it's naive to expect that overnight or in the course of a few years, just because there are more McDonald's in Beijing, or productivity is growing, that China is going to transform itself. In fact, our framework implies that the longer a despotic leviathan lives, the harder it will be to dislodge it, because it's taking root. It's reshaping society in its own image. It's making society prostate and weak and meek, and that's very difficult. Where is that going to come from? And look at what's going on in Hong Kong. The only way that China can become truly democratic, respect human rights, respect civil society, is for civil society to demand it and take it. But the Chinese state is so powerful and the West is so permissive for China that the only places where that such awakening could have taken place in the past, Chinese universities and small urban areas, they have been completely suppressed after Tiananmen Square. Hong Kong has been completely suppressed, and Taiwan is now the only place, and Taiwan will be suppressed too. Make no mistake on that. That's next. So that is what the despotic leviathan does. It cannot tolerate dissent. It will not tolerate dissent. So right. No, I don't think that there is any hope that China by itself will transform its political system unless what has been the most powerful driver of the collapse of despotic regimes, a big shock hits it, like an economic shock. If you look at the data, the best predictor of when a dictatorship transforms to democracy is having a big economic crisis. So China has an unsustainable economic system as well, but it's not going to have a big crisis anytime soon. But if it did, that would be one thing that could actually destabilize the system and perhaps create breathing room for civil society. But again, I don't think it's going to be something imminent.
Right. I have a question for the economist that is in you. During the pandemic, I've seen everybody is pessimistic about the economic situation and apart from the stock market, but for the rest of the people, everybody is pessimistic. But I've noticed that the great speed of the development of the vaccine I've seen the development of biotechnology very, very rapid. The web is, we are here thanks to the web and the technology that we have. We have also seen progress in the conquer of space.
Mm-hmm.
So don't you think that this acceleration of science and technology could be a new platform after the pandemic for going behind the great stagnation that a lot of people spoke about after the crisis of 2008?
That's a great question, Danilo. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think there is anything inevitable about the great stagnation. I think if you look at it on many objective measures, we are going through one of the most innovative periods of human history. And it's not only that we are improving consumer goods or production processes. More importantly, as my friend, economic historian Joel Mukir emphasizes, we are improving the tools of making science. The tools in the hands of a scientist who can access the whole knowledge accumulated over hundreds of years in a click of a button. The measurement instruments, things that we can do for experiments, they have made tremendous progress. So that could be a great beginning for us, absolutely. But it won't help us unless we can solve the political problems. And that's why the narrow corridor is so critical, so that's so singularly focused on the politics. Because I think if we go down the digital dictatorship way or digital servitude way, where we give everything to Google and Facebook, we're not going to be able to use that amazing technological platform for bettering humanity. And bettering humanity means creating shared prosperity, but also creating liberty. Because if we are enslaved, and if we are enslaved in cages, or if we are enslaved on websites or in apps, that's not going to be what humanity wants. That's not going to be what humanity can maintain, and it's going to be something that we pay dearly for. So we need to find the right political equilibrium to further our shared prosperity and our liberty.
Professor, are you already writing the next book?
I'm thinking about it.
Yes.
And it is about what we've talked about, remaking the future, which means taking control of technology. How can we make technology, how can we maintain technology's vibrancy, that Prometheus-like energy and freedom and will to forge ahead, but directed in such a way that we as the people benefit from it.
Okay, we hope to discuss your next book here in a few years' time. Our 45 minutes are over, and it's been a very, very beautiful and interesting conversation. Very, very.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Danilo. Thank you for the amazing questions and
thank you
taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you very much, and have a good weekend. You are in Boston, I understand, right?
I am in Boston. Yes, no traveling for the foreseeable future.
Right. Thank you again, and congratulations for the wonderful book.
Thank you.
I invite everybody to read this book because it's really, really a fascinating experience. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.